Good evening, everyone. This is such a stellar and landmark occasion. Lee Child, with his biographer, Heather Martin, who I might add, is up. What time is it in London? It must be like 3 a.m.
Well, it's 2 a.m. Yeah.
Well,
I've got my second win now.
I hope you have a beverage to keep you going. And Lee probably has one of his endless cups of coffee because you live on caffeine, right?
I do. Anything that begins with C, that's my food groups.
So I would like to point out that this wonderful book, The Reacher Guy, Heather and Lee were kind enough to, and it's sort of hard to see it, but this wonderful bookmark was created by a bookstore in England, in Kenilworth, and has a scene of Coventry in the background. Patrick can hold it up to the camera so you can see it, signed by both authors. So I want to do a shout out to the bookstore that shared this with us. Heather, remind me who they are, because I remember Kenilworth.
Absolutely, you've got it. Kenilworth Books in Kenilworth, just outside of Coventry. And yeah, they were delighted to be able to share it with you, and so am I. So I hope people enjoy it. It not only has the Coventry skyline, but it's got little clues embedded in it to all of Lee's novels, and they're quite cryptic, and we still haven't had anyone find all 24.
I love it. Now, I will tell you, as a longtime devotee of the crossword puzzle, that the British version of a challenging crossword puzzle is totally different than the New York Times version and requires far more erudite knowledge to work one. I'm trying to remember, Niall Marsh once wrote a whole mystery around a crossword puzzle, and I think Robert Barnard did too. Most people who read it were completely defeated by the crossword. So for purposes of this evening, Lee Child is actually James Dover Grant. So are you going to be calling him Jim or Lee, Heather?
I'm definitely going to be calling him Lee, but I'm going to be talking quite a lot about Jim and even James. So and Jack. So we'll be moving between all those people. And
okay,
he's a complex guy.
Just in case there's any confusion, Jim Grant is Lee Child in Keep Up. Heather Martin, I will introduce her, grew up in Aix-en-Provence, Paris, and Perth, which I have to say is a truly diverse background, where she would fall asleep to the sound of the Indian Ocean. She read languages at Cambridge and did a PhD in comparative literature, and has held teaching and research positions at Cambridge University, University of Hull, King's College London, and most recently the Graduate Center, City University, New York. Now, her qualification for writing this book, she can tell you. I have three things that I would like to throw on the table I hope you will cover at some point. One is, having read the text, Heather is a Reacher creature. Is this biography the result of Heather's desire to write it or Lee's desire to shut her up so she wouldn't ask any more pesky questions, but instead would have to figure them out from researching a biography? Two, did you expect, Heather, that when you started to write a biography of Jim A.K. Lee, that you were also simultaneously writing a biography of Jack Reacher? It's almost impossible to keep them separate. And for Lee, I have a question, which in this process, did you contemplate the reliability of memory? Because you really had to go back, kid, a long way. Do you think, well, you can decide for yourself how accurate memory is. I think it's a fascinating question.
Me too, and that is really why I said yes. We'll let Heather get going with her questions in a minute, but I mean, she does like the books, but it was language that really convinced me that she was the right person. We were chatting about my Spanish sales, and they're better than my French sales, but not good enough. And she knows Spanish, you know, fluent speaker and reader of Spanish. And she read one of the books in Spanish and said, the reason why you're not selling many is the translation is awful. And, you know, that kind of perception, but also that kind of directness. I mean, one of the problems with being a big writer is everybody's so damn polite to you all the time. And she was prepared to be impolite. And I thought, yeah, she can do it.
So actually, let me so being famous, which is part of what's going on in this book, actually creates a kind of bubble for you. Bubble being a term that we're all now more familiar with than we were from March.
Yeah, it does. It means that, I mean, people will eventually tell you what they need to tell you, but it takes them 3 or 4 goes. And it's the thing that I find the most frustrating. I always say to people, just tell me now. And they say, oh no, everything's fine. And then 3 weeks later, they'll tell you what their problem is. And we've wasted 3 weeks.
Yeah, I do remember that moment very clearly, because, you know, when Lee sent me the book and asked me what I thought of it, basically it just came to me very, very clearly that I had a choice. I could either just be polite and say, and non-committal and say nothing and go away, which would be extremely dull and boring, or I could be honest. I mean, I didn't see it as being rude, but I saw it as being honest, yeah. And also kind of, I suppose, a way of showing Lee that I appreciated the nature and the detail of his voice and his style and his writing. So, you know, yeah, it was almost like he was setting me a little test, actually, when you look back at it, although I don't think either of us saw it that way at the time.
Well, do carry on. Sorry, yeah, that was me.
But you kind of started pretty much with where I was going to start, actually, because what I wanted to talk to Lee about tonight was sort of origin stories. And do remind us if we forget to address those points that you've raised. But and I think partly I had that idea because I'm conscious of the fact that he did first come to your bookstore quite early on in his career, and I think that was what gave me the idea. But there are 4 very popular origin stories in your history as a writer, Lee. How James Grant fell in love with America, how Lee Child was born, how he got his name, and how Jack Reacher got his name. But I actually did want to start, as Barbara has done, by talking about the origin of the biography and asking you to answer the question that people always ask me as to how it came about. I mean, I guess you kind of cut straight to the chase there, but you know, you were kind of ambivalent about the idea originally, but it arose rather organically out of conversation, I'd like to think. And then the sort of idea came to me in a flash that I wanted to do it, and I kind of didn't let go. I mean, Barbara's quite right about the pesky questions.
Yeah, I mean, I was instinctively opposed to the idea because I think that there's nothing special about my life, really. And to imagine that there's something about your life that deserves a book about it is just, where I come from, you know, pretentious and unacceptable. So I was not in favor of the concept. But like Barbara asked at the beginning, I was intensely interested in the nature of memory, which I find so tricky in a way. There are things that, I mean, completely trivial things about having a certain, say, football in a certain house. And to me, those are absolutely baked in. They're indisputable, they're true. But there comes a point after maybe 40 or 50 years when you think, wait a minute, we weren't living in that house when I got that ball. And so somehow there's a conflation of 2 things that seems impregnable to me, but simultaneously cannot be true. So that was one thing I was interested in. And it was almost like hiring a private detective to go and check it out. The other thing that I was interested in, and in particular, I thought Heather would be good for this because Heather did not grow up in Britain. As Barbara said in the intro, she's an Australian person who basically grew up outside of Britain, France and Paris and mainly Australia and so on. And therefore did not have all that baked in baggage that I've got about class and province and accent and education, all that old-fashioned English stuff, which to a large extent ruled and in a way even defined our lives back then. And I wanted, if somebody who had grown up in parallel with me was looking at it, it would be invisible to them. But I thought maybe an outsider would be able to see how it was. You know, Britain is a horrendously stratified country. It depends on who you are, where you are, as to what your potential is. Now, of course, you can transcend that, but it's an extra burden. And, you know, that's another thing I wanted to look at.
Well, you certainly transcended, but it was all weird and wonderful to me, if that's what you mean. So yeah, all equally fascinating. It's like you say about being a writer in a foreign country. You know, every detail was equally fascinating to me. As for the question of memory, I did try and test Lee's memories by going, as you know, to speak to friends and colleagues from his past. I went right back to people who'd known him when he was 4 years old. And it's weird because I think of those people mainly as little kids. School kids, because I was writing about them when they were that age. But there were times when it was basically impossible to say whose memories were the more reliable. And so really I just gave up worrying about that. And because I enjoyed all the different voices, Lee's, but also the other people's, I just let them, you know, exist together in the biography so that people could see the kind of dialogue going on between those different recollections. And I think that is probably the best you can do at approximating the truth on some of those things.
Yeah, you know, obviously it calls into question the reliability of my memory, but as you say, it calls into question the reliability of the witnesses' memory.
Exactly.
And again, the social thing back then, you spoke to a couple of women who knew me in elementary school. And
that was great.
Yeah, you know, I'm so intensely disappointed that we cannot travel, you know, because we were going to have a party with all these contributors and that would have been great. But again, thinking back, you know, those women now, my age, have a different memory, but they've forgotten how segregated we were. That generally speaking, for the lessons, we were integrated boys and girls. But outside of the lessons, as soon as recess came or lunch hour or whatever, the schoolyards were completely segregated. The girls went in a yard at the back, the boys went in a yard at the front. And that was where all the good stuff happened. And the girls had no idea what was going on, just like we had no idea what was going on with them.
Yeah, that's a fair point, which I know was, again, that's something I only learned about in the process. But for me, it was the kind of stories that Lee told me. You know, from the moment I met him, he was telling me little stories about his life, quite unprompted, if I may say so. And they did then prompt further questions from me. But one of the first ones he told me was about, well, I particularly enjoyed the stories he told me about his grandparents. I think perhaps like a lot of fans, as in the days when I was just an innocent reader, I didn't really even consider that Lee would actually have grandparents. I mean, in those days, I didn't really think about Lee Child at all. All that name meant to me was the guarantee of a good read. But when I met him, you know, he started telling me these stories, and I kind of realized then that what we all already know, that true stories, real stories, if they're well told, are just as engaging and just as gripping as fictional ones. And at the core of Lee's life was this incredible story of self-reinvention. So I was really fascinated by that. And that, you know, touches on your point about who I'm writing about. Because, you know, when it struck me forcibly that Lee Child was a fictional invention himself, I thought, hang on, I'm going to have to get to know Jim Grant. And then Jim Grant used to be James Grant, so I need to get to know him as well. And, you know, and I've always said, really, since then, that Jack Reacher was only the sort of second of his great fictional creations, because I think Lee Child is the first and the greatest. But I started to notice as well at that point how increasingly fans were interested in finding out more about the man behind the books. I mean, they were queuing for hours in the street just to hear him speak. But it was really Lee's ancestors, his immediate ancestors, that sealed the deal for me and that, you know, got me interested. So I wonder if you can start, Lee, by telling us, well, you've already started, but can you tell us about your great-grandparents in Northern Ireland, Sam and Jane Grant?
Yeah, well, let me just loop back to one thing, this reinvention notion. I mean, I got another job. Yeah, that's all. That's how I see it. I don't, anyway, my great-grandpa, and this is poignant to me because my great-grandfather in Ireland, Samuel, was illiterate, could not read or write. He was a miller, operated a water mill outside of Belfast. And he was married to a woman who actually could read and write. And she was embarrassed that if anything needed signing, he would do a very laborious X, like you did when you were illiterate. So she taught him to write his name, but just purely as a picture. You know, it meant nothing to him. He didn't know what the letters were or the words were, but he could write his name as if it were a picture, and that was she who did that. And she was, you know, a rural Irish farm worker's wife who could read and write. She was literate, but like so many at that time, was ambitious for her kids, which was a largely fruitless thing, because first of all, she had so many. What could you do with them? I think there were, I can't remember whether it was 10 or 11 kids as a whole. The eldest became a plasterer. The eldest boy, I mean, again, let's say this was 19th century, and therefore girls and boys are treated very differently, and it was really the boys that were concentrated upon. The eldest one became a plasterer in Belfast, and the middle five emigrated like Irish people did. And the youngest boy, John, by tradition, the youngest always stayed at home. The eldest and the youngest stayed, and the middle people went. And so my great-grandmother took the chaff, which is the byproduct, the wasted byproduct of milling, and fed her hens with that and sold the eggs. And after probably 15 or 20 years of doing that, she had saved up enough money to send one of her sons to school, which was my grandfather, John, who went to school. He learned to read and write, and he eventually ended up in a clerical job. So yeah, the tremendous acceleration there from an illiterate farm worker to an office-bound civil servant, and then 2 generations later, a best-selling writer. You know, I love that. I love that sort of sequence.
That's an extraordinary story in itself, isn't it? Really, that.
Well, but I mean, not extraordinary, because you know so many people were in that situation that it's not just me. I mean, I bet millions of people had illiterate great-grandfathers, but it was just the way progress was happening, the way the 19th century segued into the 20th. Compulsory free education started. It was a lovely time, to be honest, if you think back to it.
I wanted to ask you a bit more about your grandfathers, because as you well know, the story that really got me started was, funnily enough, Barbara mentioned it at the beginning. She mentioned your full name, but I didn't know what the D stood for, because in those days it wasn't on Wikipedia, and I had a look on Wikipedia and it wasn't there. It just said James D. Grant. So one day I asked, this was one of my many millions of questions, Barbara, what does the D stand for? And you know, Lee very nicely answered. He said Dover for my maternal grandfather, Harry Dover Scrafton, which I thought was a great name. But then he added, again, unprompted, the only real human among my immediate ancestors, drank a little, gambled a little, smoked a lot, which I thought was incredible. I mean, it's such a brief little story, but had a kind of a book's worth of subtext in it already. I had to find out about the aliens and the humans and the why smoking and gambling and drinking mattered so much in the definition of humanity. And so, Lee, perhaps you could set that grandfather against John, no middle name grandfather. I mean, you can see what the attraction of his attraction is to a Reacher fan. John, no middle name Grant didn't only give his lack of a middle name to Reacher, but some other elements of his experience and character as well.
The Irish one was 12 years older. You know, that was one critical difference. And Harry Dover Scrafton was, you know, it's a very grandiose name, but they were poor. You know, there were definitely 10 or 12 children in that family. from the northeast of England. It was shipbuilding on the Tyne. It's a heavy industry type of area, and they were poor. And Harry was a scrappy little kid who had zero prospects. I mean, absolutely none, except that he was a talented draftsman. He could draw. He could draw plans and diagrams. He could draw pictures. He could sketch people. And the family legend goes, and this is the sort of thing that I'm so conflicted about, because normally I would hate this as, from a social perspective. So he was in school aged about 12, and the local Duke and Duchess came to visit the school, a sort of grand visit, which is appalling, that kind of aristocratic deference that they got, I hate. But anyway, on the way around the school, and of course the school had been cleaned and prepared and beautified for the visit, and some of the children's best work had been pinned up on the wall. And the Duchess saw my grandfather's drawings and was impressed. And I guess charitably or nicely, she arranged for him to go for an apprenticeship at one of the shipyards. To become an apprentice naval architect, which meant basically drawing the plans for those ships. And you may have seen documentary coverage, these gigantic rooms with hundreds of desks and hundreds of people working by hand with pens and rulers. And so he did his apprenticeship, and he became a naval draftsman, and he had a tremendous talent for it. He was extremely good with his hands. He could draw anything, he could imagine anything, he could make anything. But of course, given the chronology of the time, he qualified, he was promoted to his junior position in the drawing office, and then the Wall Street crash happened, and the Depression came, and of course all the shipyards went out of business. So as a young man with a wife and a baby, he had to find another job, which he did with the
kind of just like you, really.
Yeah, it was similar to me, but he got it with what was then still in its infancy, the telephone system, and they had a requirement for people who could draw for things like telecommunication masts and all that kind of planning. The hitch was that they did not have a vacancy yet. He could have one as soon as the vacancy came up, but there was no vacancy yet. So they said, you'll have to go on the ditch digging crew until the drawing office vacancy comes up. So my grandfather, with these talented hands, was for 5 years digging ditches to bury cables. And then the vacancy came up, and he moved, and he started working the drawing office there. And he ended up an instructor, and still there is a small mast in Yorkshire that he designed, drew, and had built. And and the only thing really,
if you told me that, I would have gone and visited it.
Well, I don't know exactly where it is, but the thing that used to enrage me about him was that when I was, 12 or 14 or whatever, he would say to me, now make sure you work hard at your books and do well at school, because then you'll get a job and you'll be okay. And I thought, well, wait a minute, your experience was 180 degrees different than that. You worked hard, you did your apprenticeship, and you were thrown out of work. So where is the exact connection? But, that's how people thought back then.
And just sort of briefly, what was the contrast between him and your Irish grandfather?
Well, the Irish grandfather was totally uptight. I mean, he was in a sort of Puritan Calvinist way. I mean, literally, it's indescribable. That whole side of the family. And somehow my mother as well, which is why she married my father, I suppose. They were the most uptight, repressed people. And the biggest sin in life was to even consider doing anything that might be fun or enjoyable. And that's what the contrast with my other grandfather, who He was a relaxed guy. I mean, he was not a libertine. He was not a drunkard or anything, but on a Friday night after work, he would have a couple of pale ales. And on a Saturday, he would walk down to the bookies and bet on the horses. And he smoked and he enjoyed himself.
And his wife, Audrey Lyda Scott, she was born, another wonderful name. She was also very important in your early childhood because she was one of the first people, if not the first, to take you to a library when you used to go and stay with them in Otley in Yorkshire when you were a very little boy. And it was in another very small local library within walking distance of your home in Birmingham where you found, aged 4, the book that changed your life and determined the course of your future, which is obviously only the kind of thing you can say in retrospect, but it's easy as a biographer to see how it was still casting its spell over you at Sheffield University and at the moment where your first career at Granada Television imploded. But even when you were 4 years old, you intuited that there was something significant about that book. You knew it meant something important to you. So can you tell us about that book and what made you so susceptible to it, so vulnerable to it even, I would say?
Well, what made me susceptible to it was what I just said about the family. You know, I felt so at odds with my family that I was convinced, even before I could develop coherent thought, really, I was somehow convinced that I had been mixed up at the hospital and I was really somebody else's kid living with these monsters. And so the impulse to get out was huge. So I go to the local library and I was very little. And so in the children's section, and this was post-war Britain, no money. The children's section probably had 34 books or something in, you know, the infant section. And then the older children that were probably 90 books or something, and that was it. But in the young children's section, there was one of those big stiff cardboard books where all the pages were thick cardboard and stiff, and it was called My Home In. And I'm guessing that it was part of a series, you know, My Home in Australia, maybe My Home in France, whatever. But the only one our library had was My Home in America. And it was, as I say, board, and it had maybe 12 pages illustrated. And there was a New England salt box. There was a prairie farmhouse. There was a California bungalow. And then you turned over the center bit, the only drawing drawn on 2 pages, and the only picture drawn from the inside of a residence, not the outside, was New York. And this little apple-cheeked boy sitting on a low windowsill, probably on like the 80th floor, looking out over the city at night. And it was just some kind of transcendental connection. Given the desire to not be who I was allegedly am, the desire was, it just triggered some kind of thing where it wasn't that I wanted to be that boy, it was that I was that boy and somehow mislocated. And so really at the age of 4, that began my fascination with America. I just wanted to be there. I wanted to be on that window ledge, looking out at that view. I wanted it with an intensity that is hard to remember now. Because, you know, to be fair, it went away 5 or so years later when Britain became quite a hip place. You know, the Beatles in the 60s and swinging London and all that kind of thing. It kind of deflected my attention. But yeah, absolutely, that book, it wasn't that it gave me the idea of going to America. It told me that currently you are mislocated and your job is to get home as soon as possible.
Heather, could I interrupt for just a second? I think for Americans, it may be, and certainly for me as an American, very difficult to understand this intensity among many people in Britain to keep, what's the phrase, to keep yourself to yourself. But this, you know, to never crack the facade of respectability and to always think about what the neighbors would say. And you're such an iconoclast from birth, Lee, that I can see that carapace, as it were, would have been intensely difficult for you. And the other thing that I think really I took away from this book, and I I think it's true in my own family, your place in your family, the rank, the birth rank makes an incredible difference. You were a second son. I've spent a lot of time with your baby brother, much more time recently than I spent with you. And he's very different. Obviously, I didn't know Richard, your older brother, or David, your kind of invisible brother, but I do think that your place, your birthplace in your family has so much to do with parenting and how you perceive the world, how you perceive yourself. I thought that was a tremendous thing that you did in the book, Heather, was to.
Thank you. Absolutely, you're absolutely right, and I'm really glad that you brought that out. And I've always thought that that the title of one of Lee's novellas, Second Son, is clearly the most autobiographical title in the whole of his.
Yeah, I mean, it was. The contrast with Andrew, my baby brother, is I mean, he's really two things at once. He's really the fourth son, but also an only child, because we were so much older. We were all gone, really, when he was growing up from the youngest age, really. I mean, he and I never lived under the same roof as siblings. And my other younger brother was gone shortly afterward. So Andrew grew up knowing that he was the fourth of four, but effectively an only child. And that made a big difference. Yes, second was tough. And I got to point out that the eldest Richard, he had a kind of eating disorder. Soon as they tried to wean him off breastfeeding and give him solid food, he just hated it. He totally hated it, and he still does. If I were to say to you, let's go grab some dinner, you'd think, yeah, great, that's a nice thing. If I said that to Richard, let's go grab some dinner, it's like saying, let's stick a steak knife in our ear. It just hates it. And so they were very preoccupied with trying to keep him alive, frankly. And so I was somewhat overlooked and disregarded. The real, the measure of it, the metric is when they died, which was a few years ago, we sorted out all their stuff, including their photo albums. And son number one had hundreds of pictures of him. And me, I had 6. It was kind of, that was the dynamic.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what we're talking about here, the loss of your job much later on in your life is generally cited as the genesis moment for Reacher. But really, all this stuff we're talking about and have been talking about hitherto is where it all began. I remember your first editor, then at G.P. Putnam Sons in New York, saying to me, he was your first publisher, telling me that Reacher came to you fully formed and that you wrote him as if in a fever dream. I loved that phrase. I've never forgotten it. But if that was the case, it's presumably only because you'd been living with this character basically all your life. I mean, in books and stories, you were familiar with him in books and stories, which you might want to talk about a bit. But essentially, also in yourself, in the playground, you were kind of living out certain, Reacher scenarios in your life from a very young age. And in a way, Barbara, just before Lee addresses that answers the question you raised at the beginning about when I realized I was going to be writing about Jack Reacher as well. And I mean, it struck me very quickly, really from almost the very first paragraph, that everyone who picked up this book would know that Lee Child was the writer, the author of the Jack Reacher stories. To pretend otherwise for 2/3 of his life would be far too strained. I mean, it would be crazy anyway. And then I just found that there were all these sorts of, overlaps and echoes and resonances basically all the time. So they just traveled through the book together, really. Yeah, can you tell us about the sort of Reacher avatars of your boyhood, basically, fictional or otherwise?
If we're starting that far back, Reacher is a character, obviously, but he's also a symbol of not ordinary. And that, if I trace it back from the beginning, that was my desperate desire to be not ordinary, because that was such a gray, narrow, pinched, ordinary, mediocre, lousy life that I could see happening all around me, in my family, the neighbors. It was just dreadful, you know, post-war Britain, exhausted, grey. And what Barbara said, the respectability. I mean, the thing that, the shortest way to describe it is that I grew up in a religious cult. And except there was no religion involved, and the cult only had 2 members who were my parents. But they were absolutely fanatically devoted to that lower middle class respectability. Their first, second, and third thought about anything was, what will the neighbors think? And so the desire to escape translated to a desire to not be ordinary. So Reacher, having sprung fully formed, yeah, you know, Reacher is an extraordinary character. He's not afraid of anything. He's bigger than anybody, stronger than anybody. He is the man. And I wanted to be that. Although I got to say that, you know, the Granada years before I was a writer, that fit the bill too. I didn't have a fantastically important or glamorous job, but I was in a community that was stunningly creative, making fabulous things. I mean, in the 18 years that I was there, this was a British producer, but we won 300 Emmys in America for what we were doing. And actually we won 2 Oscars. We decided to open a movie division, and the very first movie we made won 2 Oscars, Best Actor and Best Actress. And so that scratched the itch very much. So that was a good interregnum for me, you know, working there, until I lost that job. Yeah, but Reacher, Reacher was everything that I was afraid of not being.
But he was also there in your sort of hypersensitivity to injustice, and you know, among your peers.
Yeah, I mean, that trait of Reacher's that, you know, which I think of as quite a feminine trait, actually, just being outraged by unfairness. You know, that was personal to me too. And people say to me now, where did Reacher come from? Well, clearly he came from 40 years of reading. Everything that I'd read, eventually, I mean, no writer can do it any other way. You just depend on what you've read and absorbed. And so all those characters, the noble loner, the knight errant, righting wrongs, for some reason I saw myself in that role, and I did operate in that role as a kid, say between the age of about 6 and 10. I was gigantic. My elder brother had an eating disorder. I would eat everything. And by the time I was a few months old, I was bigger than him, even though he was 3 years older. And I was huge. And I pretty much was Reacher when I was 9. And so I didn't like injustice. I didn't like bullying. And I had a sort of, it wasn't a protection record. It was a kind of mutual aid society where I was also poor. So I never had any like cookies to bring to school to eat or anything like that. So I would, for a percentage of everybody's cookies, I would put them on the list. And if they had a problem, I would take care of it. And I did that. I remember doing that numerous times.
But you were still looking out for your friends at high school as well. I mean, still at the age of 16 or 17, there was a particular friend of yours at school who said, you know, you would walk home with him because he was being picked on by some other guys, and you would stand up to them.
That's one of those truly fascinating things about memory, that, you know, obviously there was that situation and he remembers it in one way. I don't remember that at all. I mean, I remember going to his house and we were really good friends and we hung out all the time and we shared a lot of super important stuff around that age. But I don't remember overtly protecting him.
But that's not really surprising, is it? Because he was probably the one feeling the acute sort of anxiety.
Yeah, well, you know, he never said to me, help me out here. He never did. It must have just been organic in the natural run of things. But I was never aware. I was sort of thinking I have to look after myself. You know, 2 guys who came down the street and didn't like us. I thought that was about me. Only in retrospect do I realize it was partly about him.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, aside from the sort of very real need to provide from your family, you tend to cite three main motivations for writing. Anger, which I think is directly connected to, you know, the reacher moments you experienced at Granada in the latter years. A thirst for revenge, which is also related, and the desire to be loved. And those two things to do with revenge and the desire to be loved do go right back to your childhood. I think they were sort of already latent within you, even if they were triggered by what happened at Granada. Because that same best friend, the one who you protected unwittingly at school, said to me at the end of a very long conversation we had, the betrayal has made him what he is. And he was thinking of Granada, and he was thinking of a specific incident at school that you might want to talk about. But as a sort of painfully literal child, in your own words, you often did feel betrayed by your parents too, didn't you? I mean, quite sort of small things, but you felt them very strongly. I mean, the people who are closest to you tend to describe you as a very loyal, a supremely loyal person. But I think the obverse of that is that you felt betrayal very keenly.
Yeah, I mean, it's all mixed up with being literal. And yeah, I have a vulnerability to feeling betrayed. And the first one was sort of trivial, but utterly literal. It was a promise made and not kept, which was, as I said, I had this elder brother who was, you know, fawned all over, and quite rightly. I mean, he was a very smart guy. I mean, literally, he's a nuclear scientist, super smart guy. And of course, any parent is fascinated with their first kid and so on. So he got to be about 6, and they said they were going to buy him a watch. And so I said, "Can I have a watch too?" And they said, "Not until you can tell the time," which seemed like a fairly reasonable thing. So I was 3 at the time. And so I set about learning to tell the time, and I figured it out in a day or so. And the next day I said, "Okay, I can tell the time, can I have the watch?" And they first of all tested me, could I tell the time? You know, my dad likes clocks, and so he would have a clock and he would turn the hands to all different things, and I would tell him what time it was. And they're like, looking back on it now, I can see they were getting increasingly desperate, hoping I would fail this test, but I passed it. And then they said, "No, you can't have a watch, you're too young." So in my literal way, I thought, that is bullshit. You know, they should have said either when you can tell the time or when you're 6, whichever comes later. That's what they should have said, but they didn't. And so I felt cheated, absolutely. And, you know, that sort of thing continued. The episode you're talking about at high school was, I had a bunch of friends who were complete gangsters and reprobates. And when I was about 15, I guess, I caught some, I don't know what it was, flu or pneumonia or something like that. And I was out of school for a week or 10 days, during which time they had this scam running, where they would steal violins from the music school part of the school and take them into the downtown and sell them at music shops, you know, as secondhand violins. And that funded various habits of theirs. And this was discovered while I was out sick. And they blamed me for it because I was the only one not there. So I felt betrayed by that. And, you know, then you carry on to the Granada years, which was more of a sort of existential betrayal. My fault entirely. I bought into that, or rather I did not buy my way out of the default assumption that you would have a job, you would work hard for 40 years, you would retire with a gold watch and a pension. That's how it was. And so I worked my ass off, you know. I remember when Jane was pregnant with Ruth, I worked 60 consecutive days and had 1 day off and then another 30 consecutive days. So 90 out of 91 days I worked, and these were long shifts, often at night and so on. And I thought, this is great because I'm building this thing that, you know, I've got this new baby coming, and working like this is going to be guarantee continuity and security and all that kind of thing. But of course it doesn't. And that is, I don't feel quite the same betrayal because that was me being dumb. I should have seen the writing on the wall a lot earlier than I did. But again, that's a generation thing for me. Again, the difference with Andrew, my brother, I expected to be in one job my whole life. Andrew, when he started work, he would have a succession of jobs. And the very first thing he did on his first day at a new job was start looking for his next job because he knew it would happen pretty quick. It was a generational thing. And, that part was my fault, I think.
Let me talk to Patrick about questions because we've been talking for 45 minutes. Let's just see if we have any comments and then we'll come back.
Yeah, I do have a comment here. Somebody named Barbara asks, I'd like to know how you balance the loneliness versus the social interactions in Jack Reacher's life. For being a person that's always on the move, he displays an amazing insight into other people.
That's a great question. From whichever Barbara it was, assuming not you, Barbara.
But I'd like to blame it because it was a good question.
I mean, that is a great question because to me, as the author, that is the central feature of the books, to be honest, is that Reacher is a finely balanced tension between enjoying his solitude and being worried about being lonely. And it is a very fine balance. And he can't do either thing very well. He's alone a lot of the time, but clearly craves contact because when he gets the chance, it might only be 2 days or 3 days or whatever it is during the story, he really loves these other people. He gets on with them well. He really enjoys them. He is intensely interested in them. And as you say, perceptive about them. And I think probably that is my personality, which is why I think I became a writer, because that's what writers do. Most of the time we're alone. It's a very solitary job. And then when you do get the chance to go out, like we used to when the world was normal, Heather and I would be right there in the store now. And we would have had dinner with Barbara and we would have been talking to our old friends and we would have been talking to new readers. And I would have found that intensely enjoyable for that interval. And then after it, I would find it intensely enjoyable to be alone again. And so that tension within Reacher is what I think drives him.
Anything else, Patrick? I would like to ask a question which you answer in the book, but I think we should bring up, which is, what is the inspiration for Lee Child as your pen name? Because I'm a French speaker, so I really enjoy that anyhow, but I think it would be fun to
that was just, again, this is something that I've discovered that all writers share. All writers' households are like this, endless wordplay, endless puns and games with words. And what happened for that particular one, it was 1976, I guess it was, and we were in New York and we'd seen a show on Broadway. And we were taking the train back up to where Jane's parents lived, which was 30 minutes north of the city. And the last train out of Grand Central is always packed because all the plays and movies and so on, all the people are going home. So we couldn't sit together and I ended up sitting next to some random person who started talking to me. And he actually turned out to be a guy from Texas. And he started talking and he said, I answered and he noticed my accent was British. And apropos of absolutely nothing, he said, I've got a European car. And I said, really? What have you got? Well, back then in the 70s, Renault of France sold cars in America. And what in Europe, they called the Renault 5, which was a very nice little compact. Over in America, they marketed as Le Car to give it that kind of Parisian chic. And except this guy sitting next to me mispronounced it. I said, what car have you got? He said, I got Lee car. And so I told Jane about it. And from that point onward in 1976, everything was Lee this and Lee that. And then eventually 4 years later, when Ruth was born, she was Lee baby. And after a year or so, she became Lee Child. So when I needed a pen name, again, and you know, I took this real seriously, that because it had to work. I was broken out of work. This had to succeed. And Barbara can back this up, I'm sure, but back then in the middle 90s when I was planning it, an astonishing percentage of bestsellers began with the initial C, which is easy to understand in retrospect, because in the West, we browse from left to right and we get fatigued and bored quickly. So if your A is not really all that good because it's often transitioning from the previous genre and it's often at knee height, but that B, C, D section is where people pay most attention. So I wanted to use the letter C, and Lee Child seemed both sentimental to me.
Well,
also
exactly.
easy to remember, easy to repeat, easy to say and hear.
Well, that's what I wanted to say about it. Obviously, it was a pragmatic business decision at some level, but what is beautiful about that name is that it is fundamentally sentimental. Oh. And I think that's what is less known about that story. The sort of slightly cynical, oh, it'll sit on the shelf in the right place, is often cited, but not so much that sentimental angle. But the other thing that fascinated me, Barbara, it was that, of course, it wasn't the first of Lee's pseudonyms. And, you know, he said earlier, oh, it wasn't a big self-reinvention. It was just me changing a job and I got a new name. He was doing it all the time. He had dozens of pseudonyms.
Because the Granada thing was I was a staff director. I was, you know, contracted to Granada. I wasn't allowed to work anywhere else.
You were doing it at university, though, Lee.
Oh, I did, yeah. But that was slightly less serious. I mean, at Granada, it was a necessity. If I wanted to moonlight somewhere else, either for money or for an interesting project, it was winked at if you used a different name. And so I've had 5 or 6. And it started at university, in the university theater, but that was a sort of university students doing theater, and we would all pitch in and probably do 2 jobs each. You know, you might do costumes and makeup, you might do lighting and set design or something. And I felt it seemed amateur if a handful of people were doing multitasking. I thought we should all use separate names to make it look like we've got this gigantic crew working on this thing.
Actually, that's a really nice point, just to bring in one thing I wanted to say, which is that, you know, you had that real sense of vocation from very young, partly through reading the book, and then partly through seeing at a similar age a big stage musical, and you got very into theatre very young, and that love of theatre stayed with you throughout your life. But you did very rapidly migrate from the front of the stage to the back. And it would have been an equally honest and in some ways more revealing title for the biography if I'd called it The Backstage Guy. And I wonder if, just to sort of wrap things up a bit, you could talk a little bit about your lifelong desire to be an entertainer, but to be in the background.
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning, I wanted to be right on stage. I wanted to be in the Beatles. That was plan A, which only had basically three problems about it. Number 1, I had no musical talent. Number 2, they had no vacancies. And number 3, I was only 9 years old. But the principle, I wanted to have what they had. Not only what they got from the audience, but what they gave to the audience. I was absolutely in love with that transaction, that something that you did could make people that happy. I just wanted to do that. And so, yeah, that led me to the theater, which, you know, sadly, I have no onstage talent. I can't dance, I can't sing, I can't tell jokes. You know, I'm just not an onstage person. I had to be, I very quickly, I say migrated, but that's too active of a verb. I mean, I just ended up backstage, which really served me well. And of course, then ultimately, being a writer is the ultimate backstage job, because it's not you. It's not like being an athlete or an actor where your physical self is in the market. It's the book that's in the market. And the writer is one step behind. And it's always been one of the ironies to me, is that writing in the modern world is we are shy. I call writing show business for shy people. And we are always behind the scenes. It's the book that succeeds or fails. It's the book that people examine. But we're forced into constant onstage presence, which I got kind of good at. You know, I learned how to do it, but it was definitely an act rather than natural.
But as a backstage guy and as a writer, you still were able to engage in that transaction of, you know,
Totally.
giving entertainment and pleasure and happiness
Absolutely.
to a lot of readers, and indeed in winning the love and affection of all those readers. So you did achieve all your goals there as the backstage guy.
I did, which is why I like, you know, live theater is best for that, because you can peek out of the wings and in real time, from the glow of the stage lights, you can see the audience faces, and this rapt attention and the joy and the smiles and the laughter in real time. That is, as you know, my acquaintance with narcotics is extensive, but that looking at a theater audience having a good time is the greatest drug of all.
I kind of want to ask you one very quick thing before, I'm sure we have to stop soon, but I would like to ask you to sort of wind back to the beginning, how you felt when you actually got to read the biography, and if you felt any different to or...
Well, it was, you know, the basic shape of it I knew already, and you know, to be told that I've got an Irish grandfather is not a surprise, but the things that I loved were, I mean, I was just overcome with emotion, really, that people that I knew 50 years ago, or even in the case of those little girls at elementary school, 60 years ago, they still remember me, and they were prepared to talk with great affection. I was just absolutely blown away by that. And so in a way, the biography did nothing for me that I expected it to do, but it did a huge amount that I was not expecting.
That's a marvelous tribute, Lee. It really is. I'd like to wind this up with an origin story of my own, which is that Lee came to visit us when Killing Floor was published, and I meant to look out a photograph of a much younger Lee, and a much younger me, but actually much younger Lee, standing in front of an entire wall of books that he had just autographed. And I went on from there to sell it to people by saying that Lee Child, a British author, had in fact written a book that was a literary version of the classic American Western Shane. Jack Reacher rides into town on a bus, romances the girl, cleans up the town, rides out of town. And I have to say, Lee, that when I picked up Publishers Weekly the week before last and read David Morrell's review of the Sentinel, I just cracked up, because obviously because David's a really good friend. I've spent loads of time with him in Santa Fe. And I thought, my God, I must have told him that I don't know how many times, because he in fact talks about Jack Reacher as Shane, you know. And I do think that it's wonderful that somehow or other, whether it's King Edward's School or working in Granada or whatever, somehow you became imbued with that really quintessential American story and then wrote it.
Yeah. And let me say, I was very grateful to David Morrell for that, because David, he's the guy that invented Rambo, and he really invented the nonstop, all action, page turner thriller. And honestly, he does not get the credit that he deserves. And it would be very easy to be jealous of a guy like me, who's had it far more recognition than David has had for something that was actually far more seminal. And so it was really, really nice of him to be so enthusiastic about the Sentinel like that.
David has neither a jealous nor a mean bone in his body. He is truly one of the loveliest people I know, and had a life, I have to tell you, Lee, that was far worse than yours.
Oh, sure. Awful.
So, you know, I do think when you get to nature versus nurture, that there are people who come down on all sides of it. But David, I think, is a classic of nature triumphing over anything that, you know, would have happened. This has been so wonderful, but I think that an hour probably is our span. We should really come back and do part 2. But I want to thank you both so much. Heather, what a pleasure to meet you. And thank you very much again for these beautiful book plates for setting it up and for this wonderful book, which, as you can see, the thickness of it alone indicates a complicated life. So Lee, you really are, I think it's incredibly brave of you to have done this. I really do. To confront your own life and other people's views of it, I think takes a lot of courage and a lot of honesty. So amazing. Congratulations.
And thanks to Heather for writing it, and also thanks for being up at what is now 3 a.m. in London. So,
oh, it doesn't feel like it. It doesn't feel like it.
Absolutely. It's really been a pleasure. Let me just check with Patrick. Is there anything else that people have asked that we want to answer before we go?
Just a question, Lee, about the status of the TV series, the Jack Reacher TV series. Is that still a go?
Oh yeah, that's still a go. That is, like everything else in 2020, is somewhat slowed down and speed bumped by the pandemic. We've cast it. We got Alan Richardson to play Reacher, who literally we scoured the world. He is the right guy. I mean, I could not afford for another mistake to be made about the casting, and so this is absolutely the guy. And we were going to start shooting pretty soon, actually, in Georgia, because that's where they picked out to do it. But the pandemic is so bad down there that there's really no way even to make a quarantine set or anything like that. So it is now postponed until the spring for shooting, which is a shame, but absolutely we'll get there. And it probably won't be any later on the air than it would have been anyway. So yeah, it's progressing. I've read the scripts, the screenplays are great. It's going to be terrific. It really is.
That's exciting. I would like to add that Lee will be back with us on October 26th at 5 o'clock Pacific time, excuse me, to do the Sentinel. And depending on the weather, because Andrew has said that his internet connection may be fraught with peril. I'm not sure whether it'll be all Lee all the time from Colorado or whether Andrew will be able to join us, but ideally both of them will be here.
Whether or not it's going to be snowing, because he gets his internet through a satellite dish, and if it gets filled up with snow, he's either got no internet or he's got to run out there with a brush and get the snow off the dish.
Which would certainly make for a dreamy program, wouldn't it? Well, in any case, Lee and I will be here on October 26th, and with any luck, we'll have Andrew with us, which will be great. Heather, thank you again, and Lee, thank you. And I want to thank all of you who joined us for an hour this evening. Many thanks. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you. Bye.